So, do you need to speak Japanese to live in Japan or to retire in Japan? Kind of. Let's talk about it. So this question has actually come up a few times this week, which is why I decided to make a video about it. So it came up in comments on the YouTube channel, it came up on Twitter, it came up on Facebook as well. And so obviously this is something that people are thinking about, something that I have quite strong opinions about, and I didn't have an idea for a video, so it just seemed perfect for today. And one answer to that question is no, you don't need to speak Japanese to live here, and you don't need to speak Japanese to retire here. Plenty of people have done both of those things with very little command of the Japanese language. I know several people here in Sendai who've been here for decades, and their level of Japanese is still at the, order a beer in a bar, say hello, and stumble through the early stages of a conversation level of Japanese. And they're fine, they're perfectly happy, they're living here. And so, yeah, you don't need to speak Japanese to live here. You don't even need to speak Japanese to retire here. And I would say that in order to retire in Japan, you should really have permanent residence or naturalize as a citizen. And to become a permanent resident in Japan, there is no language test, there's no language conditions on getting permanent residency. You can get permanent residency with no Japanese whatsoever, and that is perfectly fine. If you wanted to naturalize, there is a language requirement. I think it's something like you need to have the equivalent language ability of an elementary school third grader, which is an 8-year-old. So you should have the same kind of Japanese as a normal 8-year-old in Japan. However, this is not strictly applied across the board. I think it depends very much on which officer is handling your naturalization request. And so you may or may not be held to that. The reason I say that if you wanted to retire here, you should be a permanent resident or a naturalized citizen is that if you are not either of those things, then you don't actually have the right to live here unconditionally. Many people live here on a spouse visa, and unfortunately that is a little bit risky because if something happens to your spouse, say you get divorced or your spouse passes away, then you no longer have the right to remain in Japan. I think you have to tell immigration within a couple of weeks, and at that point you would have to leave Japan. Now, it's entirely possible that immigration would give you another visa out of the kindness of their hearts, but they're not obliged to. And for me, that's just a little bit too risky of a situation to put yourself in, especially as you get older and you become less able to deal with things like moving country suddenly or having a fight with immigration over your residence status. However, just because you don't need to have Japanese to live here or to retire here doesn't mean that it's not a good idea to learn it. I would argue that being able to function in Japanese, to have at least an adult level command of spoken Japanese so that you can have normal conversations with people, so that you can speak normally at an adult level, it's really going to make your life better. I had a comment on YouTube this week that was something like, when I meet people, they never take me seriously. And I think if your Japanese is not of kind of adult standard, then it's quite possible that people would not take you seriously because you can't function as an adult in the language. And that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with. Now, it's certainly possible to get by. Japan is fairly accommodating of people who don't speak the language. It's getting much better at providing documentation in different languages, providing websites in different languages. You can use your phone to translate for you and read things and so on. So it's certainly getting easier, I think. But still, a couple of years ago I had to go into the tax office. I just started doing Furusato Noze, and I forgot to do the one-stop system, so I had to go in and do a paper tax return at the time. And I had a tax officer helping me with it. And at the end, he's turned to me and said, "I'm so glad you can speak Japanese," because I was helping this other guy earlier and he didn't speak any Japanese at all. And it was really tough. But that kind of proves the point. Even the tax office is willing to go the extra mile to try and accommodate you. If you're not able to communicate in Japanese, they'll try and deal with you in English and whatever. So, but it's not ideal. And there's plenty of situations where life is much easier if you can function in Japanese at that level, dealing with the government, dealing with doctors' offices, dealing with police. I've had to call the police a number of times and it's always turned out fairly well, and I think a lot of that is down to the fact that I can talk to them as a normal person. Now, it used to be the case that you could get away with things if you didn't speak Japanese or if you pretended not to speak Japanese. That's actually where the thumbnail for this video comes from. It was the old meme that, you know, when the NHK guy came around, you'd open the door and say, "Nihongo tabemasen," and they would give up and go away because clearly you didn't speak Japanese and they didn't speak English, so it just wasn't going to work. People use this to try and get out of speeding tickets. They used to dodge train fares using this, but I don't think it really works anymore. So, you know, we've got the apps now, people are more used to dealing with non-Japanese residents, and basically it's no longer possible to get away with antisocial behavior just by not engaging in the language. We had that Muppet YouTuber last year that was doing how I could go across Japan without paying any money, who was like, you know, hiding in train toilets and getting on buses and saying, "I don't have any money." And he was detained by the police eventually. So I think Japan is becoming both more accommodating and less tolerant of that kind of thing. Now, I strongly believe that being able to function in Japanese is going to make your life better in Japan. It's going to make things more enjoyable. It's going to make it easier for you to become part of society and to meet people and get to know people and do things and have experiences. But I'm really aware that it's harder for some people than it is for others. I had quite a few unfair advantages, I think. So first of all, when I was 5, my family moved to Spain and I went to local schools for a few years. I spent about 10 years in Spain. So I wasn't a native speaker of Spanish. I wasn't quite bilingual. My English was always stronger, but I was certainly completely functional in Spanish. And having that from an early age, I think, is a huge advantage, because the most difficult skill when you're learning a language is kind of becoming comfortable with using the other language and understanding that it's possible to use another language. And growing up with that was a huge advantage. So at school I did French, German, Latin. I didn't have to study Spanish, but I took the tests for it. And then in university I kind of struggled choosing between Chinese and Japanese, but I ended up doing Chinese at university, and then straight after uni I came to Japan. And coming to Japan, having studied Chinese, is a huge advantage because you're kind of familiar with kanji and how they work and how to memorize them and so on. So it was quite easy for me to learn Japanese. I was also in one of the best environments possible for learning Japanese, in my opinion, which is a school. And the reason it's such a good place to learn Japanese is because you can hear all the different registers of Japanese all in the same place. So you can hear children talking to children, you can hear adults talking to children, which is a completely different register. You can hear adults talking to colleagues, you can hear teachers talking to parents, which again is a different register. You can hear teachers talking to the principal and so on. And so you get all these different registers of Japanese, and it's much easier to learn the language naturally. Contrast that to a situation where you're mainly hearing it at work or you're mainly hearing it in a classroom, and you're not going to be exposed to all those different levels. So I passed the JLPT 2 in my second year in Japan, I think, and then it took me about 5 years to pass JLPT 1. I kept taking it every year and failing, and then not studying and taking it again and failing. And eventually I got lucky, kind of like the monkeys and the typewriters, typing out Shakespeare eventually. I eventually got JLPT 1, that was in 2008, and my Japanese has kind of stalled ever since. So I mean, I can more or less read a book, but it takes me a really long time. It takes me a few weeks to read a book in Japanese. And I really struggle unless it's something that I'm finding interesting or it's a subject that I'm familiar with. So I find it easier to read books on teaching and money, quite difficult to read novels and so on. I can watch TV, I can follow TV, I can talk to people normally, generally. I can pass for a Japanese person on the phone for a few minutes, depending on what we're talking about. I can give a talk in Japanese for 90 minutes. I can do financial coaching in Japanese. But again, my Japanese is not perfect. I'm not bilingual by any means, but I am a functional adult and I can talk to people as an adult. And I think that is really important. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, clearly that's important for me. It's an important part of my life here in Japan. But there's plenty of people that don't end up learning Japanese. Maybe they don't have the ability, they don't have the desire to do so. And so I don't have a very strong conviction about this, but I do think that having reasonable language skills is just going to make things so much easier. If you're living here, if you're planning to retire here, it's worth making that investment. It's kind of like health and fitness. So it's worth doing now to make your life better and to make your life better in the future as well. But I might be wrong. So what do you think? Are you living in Japan? Are you planning to retire in Japan with basic Japanese? Are you happy with that? Am I wrong in thinking that it's important to learn Japanese? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.